فايقين بقلوب مفتوحة وبضي العينين لا تنامي يما ولادك فايقين بقلوب مفتوحة وبضي العينين لا تنامي يما ولادك فايقين بقلوب مفتوحة وبضي العينين لا تخافي يما ولادك راجعين حنين.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this episode of the Bisan Lecture Series. Marhaba bikum fi silsilat muhadarat Bisan. My name is Joel Bainan. I'm a member of the steering committee of this webinar series. أنا اسمي جوel بينن وأنا عضو في اللجنة الإدارية لهذه السلسلة. There is a simultaneous Arabic translation of the proceedings. In order to find it, look at the globe on the bottom of your Zoom window, and if it's not there, click on the three dots with more. يتوفر ترجمة فورية إلى اللغة العربية. أبحث عن إيقونة الكرة الأرضية في أسفل نافذة برنامج زوم، وإذا لم توجد فأبحث عنها ضمن قائمة الخيارات التي تظهر عن الضغط على النقاط الثالثة. This lecture is being recorded and it will be posted on the website in a few days. It will run about 45 minutes, during which the audience will be muted. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat during the lecture. Your questions will be collected and I will ask the speaker as many as possible in the Q&A session after the lecture. Today, we are pleased to present Professor Amos Goldberg speaking on Holocaust memory and fighting anti-Semitism in a time of genocide. Amos Goldberg is a Holocaust historian and a member of the Academy for Equality organization. Part of Professor Goldberg's work focuses on the Jewish experience in the Holocaust, and part of it on Holocaust memory and historiography. Among his publications is his co-edited volume with Bashir Bashir, The Holocaust and the Nakba, A New Grammar of Trauma and History, published by Columbia University Press in 2018. The introduction to the book has been translated into Arabic and the entire book into several European languages. Professor Goldberg is among the initiators and drafters of the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. He has contributed dozens of articles to numerous media outlets in Hebrew, English, and German. In April 2024, he published an article, Yes, It Is Genocide, acknowledging that what is happening in Gaza as a genocide. This article was translated into several languages, and since then, he has been very outspoken on this issue. Professor Goldberg, the Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just a second, I will share the is it shared?
No.
Okay, now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Joel. Under normal circumstances, I would say that I'm very happy and deeply honored to speak at this forum. But for the past 2 years, the words happy and honor have lost their meaning in the face of the endless suffering in Gaza, in Palestine, and also in Israel. So I will simply say that I am grateful to the organizers for inviting me and allowing me to share with you some reflections on one particular aspect of the current genocide out of solidarity with the victims. A few days ago, the Holocaust Museum in Los Angeles released an online poster. Never again cannot only mean never again for Jews. The poster shows brown and black hands clasped together alongside a white hand with an Auschwitz prisoner number tattooed on it. Together, the hands form a Star of David. Although the poster made no explicit mention of Palestinians, it was widely understood as a reference to the genocide in Gaza, and immediately became the target of vicious, aggressive campaign by pro-Israeli supporters. Within 2 days, the poster was taken down with an apology stating that it has been a terrible mistake. The museum claimed it was an innocent, long-planned ad meant to promote, quote, inclusivity, and it was never intended to be, quote, political, you can see on the screen, and certainly not connected to, quote, the Middle East. Gaza is not even mentioned. We promise to do better to ensure that posts in the future are more thoroughly designed and thoroughly vetted. We have taken actions internally to ensure our message always remains clear and reflective of our mission to inspire humanity through truth. The grotesque of this moment hardly needs explanation. But what might still be worth examining is the distinction the museum draws between the political and inclusivity, as though genocide is not a political matter, but a question of cultural pluralism. I will get to it in the end. How did we arrive at this point? How is it that a message interpreted, even without saying it so explicitly, as taking a stand after 2 years of genocide, is immediately deemed political and thus illegitimate? How is it that the phrase never again for all is considered a shocking scandal simply because it is considered political and must be erased from public discourse with an apology offered in shame? In fact, the situation is much worse, as we all know. In the name of the Holocaust remembrance, Israel is carrying out genocide in Gaza and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, and in the name of that memory, Israel received almost complete immunity on international level. So how is it that the fight against anti-Semitism, quote unquote, is used as one of the most effective silencing tool against protest of the genocide in most Western countries? Maybe now it's changing a little bit, especially in the US and Germany, which invest endless resources in cultivating Holocaust memory culture in their own countries and preaching it to the entire world. And how is it that the same fight against anti-Semitism, which became the main lesson of Holocaust remembrance, serves as the primary moral justification system for dismantling democratic institutions, including universities, and for arresting students, Palestinian students and other in the US, and perhaps even, if to a lesser extent, also in other countries like Germany? These are the questions I would like to begin to grapple with today. I'm, of course, not the first one. Many did so, among them Pankaj Mishara, Enzo Traverso, Marian Hirsch, and others had done it before, but perhaps I can shed light on some additional aspects. But before I start, so I will be, of course, analyzing it critically, but the whole field of Holocaust memory and Holocaust studies. But before I start, I want to make a disclaimer. I will be talking about Holocaust mainstream institutionalized memory. But out of this field of Holocaust studies have also emerged some of the most critical voices, such as Marian Hirsch, I just mentioned, Raz Segal, Omer Bartov, and others, who have articulated a precise and incisive criticism of Israel's action in Gaza, identifying them as genocide, even in its early stages. So I will go back and I'll try to very briefly try to how I see this history, not very remote history. In his 2012 book, Foundational Past, Alon Confino observed that Holocaust became, and is not the only one, of course, Tony. I mean, it has become a commonplace, became a foundation past for the West and perhaps even beyond. By, just a second, by, now I quote, by foundational past, he explained, I mean an event that represents an age because it embodies a historical novum that serves as a moral and historical yardstick as a measure of things human. In his eloquent words, Confino summarized some 2 or 3 decades in which the Holocaust served for the West as a powerful moral and historical symbol for what the West thought it stood for: liberal democracy and human rights. Until the 70s, very briefly, I would say, Holocaust memory was not central in Europe's post-war identity. It was actually a left and at times revolutionary factor or memory, which challenged the social order. "We are all German Jews," shouted the 1968ers in the streets of Paris. But this started changing in the 70s. The event that is usually perceived as marking this shift is the broadcasting of the miniseries Holocaust in 1978, first in America and then around the world, in Europe. This was a 4-part miniseries that captivated millions of viewers across the Western world and overnight made the Holocaust public and cultural agenda topic. In fact, but the process began earlier, in the early 70s, among other factors, and it's not the only one, but this is the one I want to stress here, due to Israel's increasing diplomatic distress following the 1967 and 1973 wars, and also the 70s were very difficult for Israel in the diplomatic arena. You remember the 1975 UN resolution equating Zionism to racism, and the invitation of Yasser Arafat to the UN, and the oil embargo. And as a result, the Holocaust became more and more dominant in Israel, gradually successful soft diplomacy. The most significant years of the consolidation, shaping, and especially institutionalization of Holocaust memory were the 2 decades between 1985 and 2005. During these years, most of the significant institutions and cultural works in the field were established. Among them, Claude Lanzmann Field Shoah, which was released in 1985. I should say that it started in the Israeli Foreign Office in 1972. Then it detached from it, but this is where the idea started. And then the launch of the journal Holocaust and Genocide Studies in 1986. The opening of 1993, the opening of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and then Schindler's List, and the organization that will soon become the IRA, which we will focus on a second, and the inauguration of the big monument in 2005 in Berlin. And then on UN in November declared January 27 and the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, Global International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Many actors and many factors contributed to the formation and entrenchment of Holocaust memory as the foundational past of the West. During these years, and it was really a high complex process. It was not only Jews and certainly not only Israel who promoted it. It was to a large extent a Western project. On the one hand, it was tied to the immense traumatic historical weight of the events for Jews and in different ways for Germans, other European nations, which waited 1 generation to erupt. But it also had mainly to do with the end of the Cold War, the unification of Germany, and the emergence of the European Union. The West, on both sides of the ocean, or maybe all sides of the ocean, sought a new organizing narrative to replace the story of the Cold War struggle between the free world and the autocratic world beyond the Iron Curtain. The idea of human rights and liberal democracy filled its place, and a liberal democracy filled its place, and the Holocaust as a global narrative supported and established it. During these years, especially in the 1990s, a post-structuralist, in parallel, and it's not disconnected, a post-structuralist and postmodern intellectual agenda also took shape. One of its major topics, to be super reductive and to make a very broad generalization, center on the challenge of the other of Europe, of course, whether ethnic, religious, social, cultural, linguistic, political, psychological, or psychoanalytical, disrupts order, creates structural incoherence, and prevents, or to echo the forgotten style of Derrida, always already prevents the possibility of full integration. The Holocaust and the Jews served as central symbol within this discourse. The Jew, quote unquote, was perceived as the ultimate other of Europe, posing a significant challenge to the modern political and cultural order since the French Revolution and the emancipation of the Jews. The Holocaust, in turn, was seen as a violent and catastrophic attempt to finally solve this historical problem of the Jewish other. As such, the Holocaust itself became the traumatic other of European history, raising within this discourse a unique problem of representation. A rich lexicon of powerful signifiers, including trauma, testimony, survival, Auschwitz, survivor, homo sacer, and other, were used to articulate this challenge of the other, all ultimately linked to the Jew and the Holocaust. The writing of Levinas, Lyotard, Agamben, Shoshana Feldman, and others expressed this. Within this intellectual discourse, the Jew was often abstracted and at times even romanticized, distancing itself significantly from the historical Jews of the 20th century, whose history was very complex. It certainly did not, it abstracted the Jews in Palestine, who came, many of whom came from as refugees from the Holocaust and other anti-Semitic persecution, but at the same time established their state by ethnic cleansing the Palestinians. In this year, therefore, the Jew not only acquired the status of the ultimate victim of the Holocaust, but that of the ultimate other, compelling Europe, and many times in a very positive way, to rethink itself in an exclusive and pluralistic manner. Holocaust memory, therefore, was infused from its inception and certainly throughout the 1990s with two different very strong sentiments. The first is a sentiment I would call democratic or human rights oriented. The second is empathy towards the Jews as the primary victims of Nazism, the real Jews, and perceiving them as the ultimate other of Europe. These two sentiments infuse the field with its moral libido, giving it significance and importance in attracting excellent researchers to the field of Holocaust, researchers and curators and many others. Between these two sentiments, there was a certain tension from the very beginning. The first inspires to what was perceived as universal, while the second, despite all abstraction, remains particular. From the outset, the field was required to mediate between these two sentiments. The programmatic statements of, I'll take just one example, of the Journal of Holocaust and Genocide Studies in its first issue, published in 1986, are very interesting because the creation of the journal is a necessary step in establishing any academic research field. The journal was an initiative of several scholars who had been engaged in the field since the 1970s, but primarily as initiative of the Israeli Holocaust researchers, historian Professor Yehuda Bauer, was also its first editor-in-chief. In the programmatic opening statement, Bauer argues that the journal's aim is to establish multidisciplinary research on the Holocaust as a research field. It then elaborates on the precise relationship between the Holocaust and genocide. Thus, he concludes, what is clear, however, is that the Holocaust informs, now I stress it's perhaps other forms would be a more appropriate term. It's not the same form, it's other forms of genocide are of similar nature. In other words, they are closely related at least. And for this reason, journals should also address other cases of genocide. 2 points are worth noting here, despite the very subtle articulation. First, the main subject is Holocaust research. The study of genocide follows in its wake, and it is only secondary to it. However, beyond that, the emphasis that although there is a connection between the Holocaust and genocide, they do not belong to the same form of violence. The hierarchy is clear and related to Bauer's perception, the uniqueness of or what later he referred to unprecedentedness of the Holocaust. So it's a kind of sui generis. Indeed, among the 9 articles in the first issue, 8 deal with the Holocaust, and 1 addresses the expulsion and extermination of the Choctaw Nation in 1830s in North America. I should also mention that the media tycoon Robert Maxwell was the first publisher of the journal. Maxwell was, in all likelihood, an Mossad agent and was given a lavish funeral in Israel after his death, attended by Prime Minister at that time and the President. So, at the level of financial support, the journal was linked to interests associated with the State of Israel. The new journal also received the blessing of the new UN Secretary General Javier Press, giving it a global aura. This was followed, and this is very important, by several pages interview with Elie Wiesel. Wiesel, who is the most perhaps identified person with the Holocaust memory and Holocaust testimony, also struggles between the particular and alleged universal, but he also relates to Israel. He laments the fact that the lessons of the Holocaust have not been learned in Cambodia, Ethiopia, or other distant places, and also in America itself. He was very vocal about all those things. Human beings are not sensitive enough to suffering, he complains. And now I will quote, "Some people are sensitive only to one category of victims, not to the others. That is wrong." And this despite the fact that we can watch, and he says, the atrocities live on TV. Wiesel laments that people are not sensitive to suffering and pain of the victims, and then spots the problem. Today, it is more politicized. Again, it is politicized. That's its problem. When Israel suffers, people remain insensitive to this suffering. I believe that sensitivity must be broadened and deepened, and to be sensitive to Jewish suffering means we are sensitive to all suffering. And later, when he refers to his assertion that God was the only one who did not respond to the Holocaust, he explained what should be God's sole adequate response to an event in such magnitude. The only way, the coming is the coming of the Messiah. This is the only response possible, because otherwise nothing is a response. So this is what he expected from God. But here you know that Israel is said to be a response. This places on Israel such a terrible burden. It is therefore possible to clearly reconstruct Wiesel's train of thought. The Holocaust was universal significance because the suffering of the Jews carries universal meaning. Identifying with the suffering of Jews during the Holocaust expands and deepens the ability to emphasize with suffering other around the world, and particularly with Israel's suffering, which has to be depoliticized. The importance of the State of Israel in this context is in fact theological, as it substitutes God's messianic promise that could only be his appropriate response to the Holocaust. The journal, and I give this example because this is an academic journal, and that in which somehow places this in its inauguration. The journal thus placed right at the moment of inception a manifesto of post-Holocaust national Jewish theology that sanctifies the status of the State of Israel, while also seemingly going hand in hand with the sensitivity and commitment of universal values. But Elie Wiesel was indeed very sensitive to all these, including in Bosnia, but he did not say a word about the Palestinian. On the contrary, he was always on the side of Israel. And therefore, as Hussein Ibish was therefore very right to conclude that Elie Wiesel's moral imagination never reached Palestine, and that his humanitarians knew no bound except where it met his nationalism. It is interesting to compare this in this context the words of Elie Wiesel to Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt, for example, who already in 1951 connected between the Holocaust and the Nakba to the concept of a refugee. I will not read it all. Or to the simple and very straightforward words of the Italian great writer and Auschwitz survivor Primo Levi, 1982, concerning Israel-Lebanon war and the massacres in Sabra Veshatilia. He says, human beings, Levi argued, are not overly violent, but rather excessively obedient. They obey and follow orders just as the Nazi did, just as the Americans did, albeit slightly less, in Vietnam, and as the Israelis are doing today in Lebanon. So simple without theological complication. However, and really, Primo Levi was already a very significant, if not the most significant, one of the not less significant in his prose, which is much more powerful in my opinion of the Holocaust than Elie Wiesel. But it was very clear to him. However, this Levi kind of criticism gradually disappeared with the institutionalization of Holocaust memory as a hegemonic Western memory that underpins allegedly the value of human rights. Within the framework of the new global Holocaust discourse, the sentiment of human rights as related to the Holocaust was rarely directed against Israel, which was perceived in this discourse. So nobody told them, how can you do, I mean, it was not a main, how can you do what you do? We learned some other lessons from the Holocaust. The discourse was not, which was perceived Israel not as a, again, very broad generalization, not as a sovereign state in the mainstream, of course, committing crimes, but as the state of the Jews, the survivors of the Holocaust, the ultimate others of Europe, deserving of empathy and understanding. Moreover, the 1990s were the years of the peace process and the Oslo years. The West Bank settlement enterprise was relatively still in its infancy. Very few in the Western world spoke about the 1948 and the Nakba at that time. Thus, the contradiction was bearable during those years. The rupture came in the early 2000s. As the historian Charles Meyer suggested already some 25 years ago, alongside the dominant global Holocaust moral historical Holocaust narrative that I now started describing, emerged in the 90s another narrative and began to penetrate very forcefully into the Western academia and culture, precisely during those years. The post-colonial discourse that emerged long before in the global South migrated into American universities during that period. The discourse revolutionized the way parts of the West began to perceive themselves, from ones that, again, very broad, despite various obstacles, the Holocaust among them, viewed its historical trajectory as teleological progression of enlightenment, progress, and justice, again, very, very broad words and generalization, it transformed into one that increasingly revealed its own terrible crimes, including genocide and horrific mass violence committed by Western colonial nations, including by democratic or liberal states. Between these two global narratives, Holocaust and the post-anti-colonial, an unresolved tension emerged. Sometimes they also entangled, as Michael Rothberg has shown us. There was a dispute over material and symbolic resources, for sure, but it went far beyond that. The Holocaust moral historical narrative, despite its catastrophic content, served as, at the end of the day, a reassuring narrative to an identity narrative, reassuring identity narrative. The lesson of this story suggests, and again, very broadly, that if we adhere to our democratic values, strengthen civil society, and mitigate extreme ideological tensions, we can protect ourselves against this kind of criminal behavior, while strengthening our own identity as the good guys, those who uphold freedom and democracy and commemorate the Holocaust. The anti or post-colonial narrative was and is a far more critical one. According to this narrative, colonialism, as we all know, and particularly settler colonialism, is not an aberrant deviation of the Western trajectory of enlightenment and emancipation, nor is it the dark and anti-liberal side of modernity. It is rather a reflection of the imminent criminality of modern Western culture, even and perhaps especially in its liberal form. For liberal democratic regimes have also been involved in violence, murder, and we all know racism, oppression, and even genocide of non-European peoples and societies throughout the world. However, these two narratives clashed head-on the issue of Palestine and Israel, because while Israel as the state of the Jews, the ultimate, as I said, the ultimate victim, etc., had, as I try to say, to suggest almost a semi-theological place in this discourse, anti-colonial discourse pointed to the Korean colonial and particular settler colonial components of Zionism and the state of Israel. It indicated that European Jews, with the support of the great powers, initially Great Britain and ultimately the US, seized and displaced the indigenous population of Palestinians in 1948 through 1967 and to this day. Within this discourse, Israel was not seen as a moral solution to the problem of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, but rather as a particularly acute expression of murderous and dispossessing European racism. The mainstream global Holocaust narrative not only failed to address this truth, it actually blocked it and suppressed it. Obviously, the understanding of Zionism as an imperial and colonial phenomenon did not start in Europe, and as we know, Palestinian intellectuals started articulating this from the beginning of the 20th century, perhaps even before, but certainly after the Balfour Declaration in 1970s. Anyhow, a critical turning point in this context and this rival was the UN Conference Against Racism held in September 2001 in Durban, South Africa. A second, I have to. At this conference, Israel managed to prevent, with the help of the US and several Western countries, harsh official resolutions against it. However, in a parallel form of human rights organization that took place as part of the conference, it faced harsh and unprecedented anti-colonial criticism for the first time in such an important international forum, which included also Western organization and was backed by Western personalities. There, the anti and post-colonial discourse of the global South dominated without being constrained by powerful states. Israel was condemned as a criminal apartheid state and placed among the list of countries that occupy and violate human rights. It was accused of ethnic cleansing, acts of genocide, committing racist crimes against humanity. And of course, there was a demand of the return of the refugee. And the resolution also of this NGO conference concluded by calling for a comprehensive and total boycott of Israel, similar to the boycott imposed on South Africa. This is where, to the best of my understanding, the seeds of the BDS movement were planted. A few days after the closing of the conference, the 9/11 attack happened, and the world was in a way transformed. As it happened, and of course, the war on terror that the President Bush declared. As James Renton had put it recently, the US-led war on terror and an ensuing migration crisis that followed the Middle East and North Africa, combined with the global economic earthquake of 2007 and 2008, produced a culture of existential insecurity among the international political elite of the global North. The haunting figure at the center of this culture was the idea of the revolutionary Muslim pitched against the liberal democratic state. This gradually changed Holocaust memory. It supported the liberal human rights regime, which we saw was never applied in the name of the Holocaust to Israel, to focusing on gradually moving to focus on Muslim anti-Semitism. Holocaust memory started migrating from the liberal center to the right and the radical right. Israel was very quick to seize the moment. Since Durban, the anti-colonial Palestinian narrative was perceived as a strategic threat and was labeled anti-Semitic. From now on, anti-Semitism, which, for example, was dealt until then in various marginal committees in the Knesset, became a permanent topic on the agenda of the most important and parliamentary committee for security and foreign affairs, which protocols are still not disclosed. And there was also a conference. I mean, it absorbed the Israeli government and Israeli elite since then tremendously. Israel turned Holocaust memory and the fight against anti-Semitism to a prominent aspect of its soft and aggressive democracy. I will now give two famous examples how Israel promoted the Holocaust memory within this discursive framework of human rights, while transforming it to become its shield of impunity, one more soft and one more aggressive. The 2005 UN resolution on January 27 as the International Holocaust Remembrance Day is the first example. I will not read it. The resolution was initiated by the Israeli Foreign Ministry with the clear aim, as its initiator, Ron Adam, from the Israeli UN delegation at the time, explicitly admitted, it's online, you can listen to it, to provide an alternative to the Palestinian narrative that was perceived by Israel as dominant UN institution. The resolution itself has a very universal character. It mentions Jews only once and does not refer to the state of Israel. You can see at the bottom, like it also defines Holocaust as in a very broad way, much beyond the murder of the 6 million Jews. But in contrast, the word rights, human rights, I highlighted it, appears 9 times and extensively refers to various articles in the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention, which was also adopted both from 1948. Thus, on the face of it, the declaration does not serve the Zionist narrative that connects the Holocaust to the state of Israel. I would almost say the opposite. It serves the idea of universal human rights and freedoms on behalf of which Israel is criticized. However, the Israeli delegation consciously compromised this formulation to get a unanimous support, also a trick with the chair of the session, from the members of the assembly. It was adopted unanimously. They knew well that in the end, these small details were less important. What would be established is global consciousness, while the international, in global consciousness was the International Holocaust Remembrance Day as a global day, as a very special day, linked to the tragedy of the Jews and therefore to the state of Israel, even if this was not explicitly stated. And they were ultimately very correct. Another outcome, and here I go 10 years later, of these processes was the initiative by Israel and its supporters to equate harsh criticism of Israel and opposition of Zionism with anti-Semitism. A process that reached its peak in 2016 with the publication of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. It has its own history, which started at that 2005, that very year that we dealt with before. And this, it's called the Holocaust Remembrance Working Non-Legally Binding Definition of Anti-Semitism, which is adopted by many Western countries and even beyond by hundreds of organizations, including soccer, football clubs, and became a quasi-legal and at times a full legal tool, a tool which serves now also to suppress the encampments and pro-Palestinian protests. This definition effectively turns Palestinian anti-colonial liberation discourse into an expression of anti-Semitism. For example, the claim that Israel is a racist state, like all settler colonial states, and actually like most of the countries in the world perceived in one way or by some as racist, is considered anti-Semitic. So too is the denial of the Jewish people the denial of Jewish people the right to self-determination, even though Israel's official policy is the denial of the Palestinian people's right of self-determination. Moreover, according to this definition, drawing comparison between contemporary Israeli policy and that of the Nazis is considered anti-Semitic, even though in Israeli political discourse, comparison of Palestinians and the leaders to the Nazis have been extremely common since the founding of the state, and certainly now. The Irish definition of anti-Semitism has become what the Israeli philosopher Adi Ophir called Israel discursive Iron Dome. And you can see it like a real, it's an international document, which is, all of it is projection. Like we do it and we project it on you. In this way, Holocaust memory, as it was shaped and institutionalized by powerful states and institutions, and the IRA is an organization of today 35 states, mostly European states or Western states, and it has quite a lot of powerful influence over, governments are sending their delegation. It has quite a lot of influence to shape policy on those matters. Needless to say that the global south is almost not represented there. So in this way, Holocaust memories, it was shaped and institutionalized by powerful states and institutions, became a mechanism for shielding Israel and Zionism from criticism, enabling the occupation and the apartheid, and preventing any meaningful discussion about the Nakba and any solution but this two-state solution slogan. Said differently, as Israel could not justify its policies within any liberal political discourse, it turned to the Holocaust and anti-Semitic discourse, and it works quite well. The supposedly universal dimension of mainstream Holocaust memory has been steadily eroded, but from within, by using the very same universalist discourse of human rights, anti-Semitism connected to it. At this point, I must stress that one needs two for tango, and while I put much emphasis on Israel promoting these policies, the West went along and promoted it just as well. It was a joint project, again, in a very, very broad and inaccurate terms, to create a Judeo-Christian alliance in which Israel is a cornerstone and which excludes to various degrees Muslims, Arab, Palestinians, and migrants. And then came October 7th. And the genocide that followed. For Israelis, like myself, it was traumatic, shocking, and criminal. Also for me, it was all too personal and traumatic. And of course, I'm not reducing, by now I hope you understand that I'm very well aware of the context. But so was Israel's response that has become very quickly genocidal. Holocaust memory not only failed to generate any criticism of Israel, it actively served to justify the genocide in Gaza and blocked any effective critique of it. Thus, as Zoe Samouji and Raz Siegel have shown, and many others, October 7th was perceived by Israel and the West, at least in the first year and still lately, maybe you can hear it still now, as a second Holocaust or connected to the Holocaust. Israel, one of the most powerful military powers in the world, was once again seen as the ultimate victims, as Jews standing helpless before a new Nazi threat. The widely repeated statement that October 7th was the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust, though factually probably true, constructs a false, which you hear over and over again, constructs a false analogy as if there is a direct continuity and connection between the two events. And because the war is seen as being waged against Nazis and in order to prevent a second Holocaust, the once naive and somehow hypocritical imperative of never again a Holocaust becomes a sadistic and cruel imperative of again because of the Holocaust. And the commandment, thou shalt not kill, becomes thou shalt kill because of the Holocaust. Genocide, ethnic cleansing, and dehumanization, racism were now justified and normalized as the primary lesson of the Holocaust, particularly in Israel, Germany, and the United States. On the other hand, the fight against anti-Semitism as a central lesson supposedly learned from the Holocaust now serves as a pretext for dismantling effective criticism of genocide and as a tool for governments to suppress basic democratic institutions, first and foremost universities and the encampments and the Palestinian protesters, while gradually or rapidly sliding into authoritarianism or perhaps something worse. Now, I will. This is obvious, but it's all around. It's much more than those big events. I want to take two examples from Germany. Katharina von Schnurbein, the European Union's Commissioner for Combating Anti-Semitism, for example, recently claims that a simple act of solidarity with the Palestinians, such as baking and selling cakes to donate to Gaza, is, and she coined a new term, ambient anti-Semitism. Meanwhile, memorial centers and former concentration camps such as Buchenwald have issued brochures listing supposedly anti-Semitic symbols, including the keffiyeh and even the call for ceasefire. Let's go back 2 years. In February 2022, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken chose to come to United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington to announce that the US recognized in Myanmar attack on the Rohingya in the Rakhine state as genocide. Blinken emphasized that he specifically came to the Holocaust Museum to make this declaration because Holocaust memory imposes on us, as he says, a contemporary moral responsibility. He also noted his own connection to the Holocaust, as his stepfather was a survivor himself. The evidence of genocide in Myanmar, as well as the extent of destruction and murder there, is horrific and devastating. But what is taking place in Gaza seems to be much worse, and the evidence for genocide is much clearer. And as William Schabas recently asserted, the case filed by South Africa against Israel at the ICJ is arguably the strongest case of genocide ever brought before the court. Yet, can anyone imagine Blinken or any other Western leader appearing at the Holocaust Museum in Washington to declare, out of commitment to Holocaust memory, that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza? The opposite is true. Nearly all the many hundreds, perhaps thousands of Holocaust remember institutions worldwide have remained silent about the crime in Gaza. So have most Holocaust scholars. Some of the institutions and scholars have even explicitly sided with Israel. And I know maybe the Los Angeles Memorial Museum, which we started, tried to say, but backed off very quickly. I know maybe of one, just other one that said something. Just recently, an open letter was published with allegedly hundreds of scholars' signatories denying the genocide. Mouin Rabbani has aptly called it a Scholars for Genocide open letter. Moreover, simply drawing comparison between Israel and the Holocaust, and contrary to what we have just seen regard to Myanmar, for example, and as we saw even Elie Wiesel with Ethiopia, Cambodia, United States civil rights, always he put the Holocaust in center stage. It is perceived as wrong, morally corrupt, morally wrong, and anti-Semitic. The position of the AJC, American Jewish Committee, is typical in this regard. These comparisons are not simply misguided or exaggerated. On one hand, they trivialize the Nazi atrocities. On the other, they invert historical roles, casting Jews victims of an unparalleled genocide as if it's in the genes as today's oppressors. The result is an assault on memory itself, and most urgently, the rising and contribute to the rising anti-Semitism. Thus, mainstream Holocaust memory has become part of the problem of genocide, to paraphrase Dirk Moses' book's title, instead of part of its solution. It has become what scholars called, and it's really horrible, enabling factor for genocide rather than a preventing force that cultivate moral sensitivity and political awareness to help fight genocide and mass violence. Today, the dominant political interpretation, certainly in Israel, but I dare say even in a more disguised ways in the Western world, of the slogan "Never Again" is Rabbi Meir Kahane, the racist spiritual father of Itamar Ben-Gvir, which is also, as you can see, the title of his 1971 book. I will conclude with one final remark. Let me return to the distinction with which we opened, the distinction between the political and the inclusive, which stood at the heart of the humiliating apology statement made by the museum in Los Angeles. Throughout my talk, we saw how the political was repeatedly rejected and denied within the framework of Holocaust memory. We saw this with Wiesel, we saw this in Los Angeles, we saw it several other times. As early as 1993, in a brilliant essay on Holocaust memory titled A Surfeit of Memory, the historian Charles Maier, whom I already mentioned, argued that history had replaced the political. My own belief is that at the end of the 20th century, that memory had replaced the political, not history. Memory had replaced the political. My own belief is that at the end of the 20th century, Western societies have come to an end of a massive collective project. It is not just the project of communist or even socialist left or even left to coup. It is also the end of at least the interruption of the capacity to found collective institutions that rest on aspiration for the future. According to Maier, memory, and particularly Holocaust memory, was meant, despite all the talk about human rights, cosmopolitanism, to replace the political, not to serve it. Or it was a symptom of its degeneration. It was not indeed to establish, and I think he's right, it's even more severe. It might have did serve to establish some international system based on equality and rights, but more than that, and perhaps much more than that, to produce desirable identities of victims on the one hand, and Europeans and Western perpetrators who have already been purified through memory because they remember the Holocaust. And therefore, to use Lacanian terms, mainstream Holocaust memory is an engagement with the catastrophe through its interface with the imaginary rather than the symbolic. That is to say, as I have hinted, Holocaust memory is intended to produce a Judeo-Christian identity within which, again, those are very broad generalizations. I already said that many of the acting within the fields are completely different. Many of the, certainly the scholars, we name some, but we can name many. But I'm talking about mainstream and big processes that, of course, we see the outcome, within which Israel is a center cornerstone, and the Palestinians are the disruption, and particularly because their cause is so just. We must therefore return to a political Holocaust memory, a Holocaust memory that addresses the questions like how societies become murderous and genocidal, including the Israeli society. A Holocaust memory that would prevent rather than lead to the question that Dr. Ezel Adin from Gaza asks. And this is what I ask myself. If our blood this is from Gaza in 2 weeks ago, I think. Are we made of the same material? Is our blood even red? Are we made of the same material, the same suffering, the same divine breath that once awakened the lungs of a human being? If so, why do we die like vermin? Why does the world avert its eye while we rot before everyone's eyes? Why does the hunger of one kidnapped person shakes the souls among nations of the world while the emaciated bodies of 2 million children arouse only political disbelief? From now on, this will require us to always speak of the Holocaust, the Nakba, and the genocide in Gaza together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amos. We're all now past to questions that were put in the chat. People can continue to put questions in the chat if they want, but we have quite a few. So the first one, Alon Confino's conception of a foundational past, which you mentioned in the beginning of the lecture, applies to the nominally democratic Western countries. How does it land in the global South and other parts of the world? Didn't Aimé Césaire early on understand the interaction between seeing the Holocaust as a unique historic event and Western colonialism and racist violence in his discourse on colonialism published in the 1950s?
So I'll try to be very brief. Yes, certainly, and he's not the only one. Of course, we can think of Frantz Fanon, we can think of Du Bois, we can think of many others who related to the Holocaust in the way the question was asked. But I focused, and I think I focused on the Western world because this is how we see it is playing out now in the genocide. The fact that the global South and also, I mean, the global South, like the West or the global North, are not one, but the global South is Holocaust was not that meaningful, and if it was meaningful, it was as vis-a-vis the colonial violence. And I think the most interesting intellectual and enterprise, and it was done by really many, from Mahmoud Mamdani and Dirk Moses, myself also a little bit, is to see the entanglement, historical entanglements, memory, the sociological. This is why I'm so much concentrated on Bauer's exclusion of the uniqueness. No, I think also a good narrative of the Holocaust, certainly of Palestine and Israel, should take both, yes, Aimé Césaire and this perspective, also the Holocaust perspective, and strive to somehow create a more just narrative that will lead to, this is a project I'm embedded with my friend Bashir Bashir, of trying to, of Holocaust and Nakba together in an egalitarian way, not one subordinated to the other or one supports, but in those two big narratives together, in order to create some kind of what Bashir calls an egalitarian binationalism. Binationalism, in a sense, it could be cashed out in various forms, but I mean, total, complete egalitarian rights for both people. Now, this was true until October 7th. Now, I don't know, after the genocide, how to think about it. Well, in the midst of, it's just escalating.
Okay, second question. What was the role of material factors in the development of the West's attitude towards Israel as the representative of the Holocaust victims? Questions of commerce, Israeli products, the arms industry, and so on.
Well, you know, it's hard to tell because if you tend towards a more like Marxist understanding, which is more material, then you say this was all just to support the this imperialism and colonialism and the economic interests and the high-tech industry and the arms industry. This is, of course, true. So I undoubtedly this is has merit, but I think there is more to it because identities do count, and the Holocaust has become not only a product of materiality, even if we go this line, but also produced a lot of materiality because so much money is invested in it, in museums, in cathedrals, in memorial. I mean, it's a big. I don't want to be cynical, though I admire his work of Norman Finkelstein. I would not call it business. It's not on, but a lot of, and here I think this is something that creates a kind of I think it's. I would say it makes Israel materially part of Europe, not only symbolically. Now, so how to put the symbolic versus the material, they are intertwined undoubtedly, and I don't want to go one way or another. I think they are somehow circulated.
Thank you. When the State of Israel was established, it was to a great extent a project of the international left. It was supported by the Soviet Union and local communist parties around the world and many elements of the non-communist left. To what extent did this obscure the nature of the Nakba and provide a cover for the State of Israel in its aggressive stance towards the Arab world and the Palestinian people?
I'm not. I'm more Holocaust historian. I'm not a historian, though I read and also like of Zionism and the State of Israel. Undoubtedly, the left, what is considered left today, is not the left of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. As I said, I mean, the left supported colonial enterprises. The left was immersed in the left or in racism. We know that in the South of America. So it's a completely different left, I think. And it's certainly what was surprising is that the Soviet Union supported and also enabled some of its countries, like the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia at that time, to support Israel with arms. So I guess it had an impact on. It also, I would say, also made quite. Again, the literature I read quite a lot of tensions within the Palestinian population in Palestine, Israel, as the communists were somehow had to adhere to the Soviet Union party line. I think I will stop here.
Thank you. As a field of academic research, Holocaust studies is presumably populated by a range of actors, researchers, writers, teachers, and so on. Was and is this academic community entirely aligned with the institutional narrative that you've spoken about? And for those who have dissented, why has it taken them so long to dissent after October 7th? And why haven't they mentioned this mode of remembering the Holocaust as something that is inimical to Jews themselves?
It's such a huge. If we talk about, it is such a huge field, and But what I try to, as my friend Ras Siegel pointed out recently, you don't have Palestinians in this field. And you don't have, almost have no Palestinian. We try to establish once a kind of forum for Holocaust and genocide scholars, and we thought to invite, we invited also Palestinians and Palestinian scholars of the Nakba as part of, because it is completely connected. Well, we can go back to Hannah Arendt of 1951, but many others, Cesar and many who understood really as I said, the connections between the colonial violence, including in Palestine, and even and also Marxist thinkers, including Jews, understood it very well. But it was, as I said, what I tried to show, even really progressive-minded people who were in the field, somehow Israel, this is what I tried to show, was from the beginning was very central to the whole field. And you cannot talk about the Nakba, Palestinians, whether genocide, ethnic cleansing, mass violence, all in the same way you would have talked even on other, even if you broaden it beyond the Holocaust to other events. Now, this is very deep, and I would say that there is almost no language to talk about the Palestinian within this, the Palestinian catastrophes, the ongoing whatever, the ongoing Nakba, and certainly the genocide within this field. Nonetheless, some of the most vocal voices, outspoken, came from this field. I can say that Raz Siegel, already on the 13th, wrote in Jewish Currents textbooks of genocide, and Martin Shaw, who is he's in genocide studies, also wrote very others were also relatively very quickly outspoken. Omer Bartov is a very prominent Holocaust scholar, Israeli, now works in Brown. He also was very outspoken, though he was more hesitative until May 2024, when Israel also started destroying Rafah. Then he said it's a genocide, but he warned against genocide from almost day one. I can say that for me, it took a while because really already in January I started publishing, and in April 2024 I could say I'm not proud that it took me time, but if I go back again, the shock and the all around us, like a colleague of mine was at that time was a hostage. I'm trying to and it took time to be able to acknowledge and to put it all in place. And I'm not, as I said, I'm not proud of it. But all in all, many scholars did speak. Most do not speak out. And there are also those who are the deniers and all the institutions. So I think it's a combination of some did speak out, some are very vocal. I consider myself since January 2024, I'm and certainly since April. Raz, undoubtedly, Omer, Marian Hirsch, Victoria Sanford at the beginning. I mean, many of those scholars. But the field itself, as I try to explain, almost makes it almost impossible to speak within the field on the Palestinians. And we have to, this is why we have to, my concluding remarks, we have, if we want to have any, it has to be completely reshaped in a way that the Gaza genocide and the Holocaust and many maybe others are dealt within it as equally as events of not the same character, but because each and every genocide is different, but with same respect to the suffering of the victims, to the testimony. We can talk about the witness and the testimony. That is, the Holocaust has taught us to listen to the witnesses, and now in Israel you cannot hear a witness almost in most, certainly not on the public sphere and the major media outlets. You have to go to the marginal in order to listen to be able to listen to the victims' voices, which was so, I won't say celebrated, but became such a powerful powerful moral imperative after the Holocaust. But so we have to create a new field of genocide studies or Holocaust and Nakba and Gaza genocide studies together in order to transform it, I believe, to become a moral field. I'm not sure this is possible. I am really not sure this is possible.
Thank you. Was another important factor in making the Holocaust central to the meaning of World War II in the West, the reunification of Germany in the early 1990s, which led to World War II becoming in the West a war against Nazism rather than a war against Germany?
Well, I mentioned it, undoubtedly. The 1990s were crucial here, and Germany had to find, like with the EU, and had to find a new story in national narrative and of unification that will integrate it again, or continue to integrating it into the EU and enabling it to take such a major position in the EU, while the identity of the two Germanys before that was very much based on the opposition between them. So, and I mean, again, those are much more complex processes, but I'm trying to reduce. It started, of course, before, but the 1990s made, and then it became, and then the end of the 1990s, for example, so all of a sudden this field of Holocaust and final solution, Täterforschung, the perpetrators, which started already before in the 80s, consolidated, boomed in the 1990s in Germany, and it really served German and European. This is what I try to explain. It's not only an Israeli propaganda machine. Of course, it is. You saw I put a lot of emphasis in, but it was also as I said, you need millions for this tango, and somehow the political jigsaw puzzle fell together in the 1990s, and yes, then Germany started. Germany started its coming to terms with the past. Both Germanys in very different ways. Like the process of denazification in East Germany was much more fundamental than in West Germany. We know that, for example, in 1961, in the Eichmann trial, what really mattered to Ben-Gurion and to Adenauer, one of his closest closest. He wasn't a minister, but his closest consultants and not only advisor, but he had a formal, was Globke, who was one of the drafters of the Nuremberg laws and the lawyers who worked on it in 1935 and onwards. So they had still Nazis in high rank in academia, and this also happened in East Germany, but less. So the coming to terms in the 60s, there were several in West Germany, several trial cases against Nazi criminals. But in the 90s, it consolidated so, and the whole language was, and the language of memory, and the centrality of the Jewish victim was so much consolidated in the 1990s, combined with other factor with the unification of Germany.
Thank you. In Israel itself, as early as mid-1948, criticizing Israel's ethnic cleansing and the broader Nakba project was initially culturally acceptable. For example, Samach Yizhar's novella, Khirbat Chiza. What explains both the late arrival of this critique beyond Israel's borders and also the suppression of this critique within Israel in the 1950s and 60s?
This is a whole lecture on its. First of all, it was not very easily accepted. I will give a counter example where it was not that the nexus of the Holocaust and the Nakba, which was not yet called by the certainly not by the Israelis as the Nakba, was we always give the Yizhar two short novels, The Captive and Khirbat Chiza, where he makes these connections. The other very famous connection is Avot Yeshurun, which is really, perhaps in my mind, the best Israeli poet. He was not a Holocaust survivor, but he came to Israel as a Zionist and to Palestine at that time, and his whole family was completely killed, and that was really traumatized him. And he already in the early 50s, in 1952, wrote a poem, Passover over Caves, in which he put them all together, put them both together, the Nakba and he was so criticized and marginalized for this. For it took his rehabilitation, poetic rehabilitation, only in the 80s because of various, the latest in 1992, I think he got the most prestigious Israeli prize. But he was marginalized for that. And then in 1958, he answered his critiques and he said, he wrote a poem in 1958, I think, 1958, he wrote very powerful lines as I said, in a poem called Reasoning, where he said, the Holocaust of the Jewish people and the Holocaust of the Palestinians are both part of Jewish history. They gaze in each other in the eyes, or some almost those words in Hebrew. That was a scandal. And so it wasn't that easy, but it was certainly part of the everyday. For example, after Elias Khoury wrote his three novels before, like the trilogy before, the great Lebanese novelist who was completely identified with the Palestinian struggle. He wrote three novels on the children of the ghetto, Aulad el Ghetto, and there it starts with the ghetto lead of the lead ghetto, which was called because in Jaffa, in Lead, in Ramle, all those places, the remnants of the Palestinian communities were somehow concentrated in everybody called the Jews, the army, the administration, the Palestinians themselves, they call it the ghetto. So it was in the nexus of those two events was part of everyday life. And but it was not that, it was not, but then as the language of memory started consolidating, they were completely taken apart. And one was a taboo, became a taboo, the Nakba, almost you could not speak about it, and was sanctified. Now you see it, but you see it also in Palestinian literature. Now I'm not an expert, but I dare say, like, for example, Return to Haifa by Rassan Kanafani. What you have there is a meeting after 1967 of refugees who come back to their home and see, like, a Brechtian scene that they abandoned their child in the mess of the expulsion, and they come back and they find in their home Holocaust survivors, and the dialogue is very interesting, full of empathy, very tense, and it ends. But with it doesn't go. So the narrator says, "I understand. We cannot solve it peacefully. We will have to get our rights through armed resistance." And but so you had it, but as I said, also I think the turning point also outside of Israel was the 1980s and 90s, where critique that you could find, like in Hannah Arendt and Primo Levi. Primo Levi is not as radical, considered as radical, but really a genius, a very tormented soul. He committed suicide at the end, but he's really one of the best poets. He could say what he said on. It still was a scandal. It didn't go just like that. But he could say this in 1982. You can hardly find a figure in his caliber and so mainstream that would say today. So it gradually departed, but I don't think it was ever so easily discussed. You don't have a lot, except for in Israeli, in Hebrew literature, you don't have a lot. There is also a Yiddish novel that puts them together. And you can see hints for that also in poetry. You can see quite a lot, but it was not, I think, merged completely together. There is a lot, but there was a lot of hesitation and sanction on this.
Thank you. In the West, Holocaust memory is typically presented as the Jewish experience, despite the fact that there were many other groups, Romani people, disabled individuals, LGBTQ plus people, political dissidents who were also victims. Is it this narrow framing that enables Israel and its allies to claim exclusive moral authority and deflect the accusations of genocide in Gaza?
Among other factors, yes, I think yes. I mean, undoubtedly, and I think the Jews were really very central in the Nazi project. If you read Mein Kampf and you read, I mean, they are, I think, much more central in the ideology than any other group. Even the Slavs, even though they killed quite a lot of Slavs, and they had plans like the Hunger Plan and the Generalplan Ost plan, the Generalplan Ost, which was a completely imperial colonial plan to settle the East, like really a textbook of settler colonialism. But the figure of the Jew was central to their ideology, to their to the Nazi state, more than any other. I think more than any other group. Nonetheless, this doesn't make any other group less victim, and more than that, the entanglement of the various projects of violence, Nazi project of violence, is the most important and most interesting thing. Like, you cannot understand, I think you cannot understand the final solution without understanding the annihilation of more than 3 million Soviet prisoners of war at that time. That started, and vice versa. And of course, the other groups that you mentioned. I think, and this is why my critique of Bauer was, that putting like the Holocaust over, the Jewish Holocaust over, without understanding the entanglement of those with other aspects of the Holocaust and with other aspects of modern violence, like Hannah Arendt has done, like Zygmunt Bauman has shown, and many others. Yes, you, in a way, it is certainly this uniqueness in identifying the whole event with just one group is part of the problem. And as I showed, in the 2005 UN resolution acknowledging 27th of January is the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, they define it very, very broadly. And they say something, we can go back to the, something like, which resulted in which resulted in the, and this is where the only time that Jews are in the annihilation or destruction of the of 6 million Jews and other minorities. It's something like that. So it really is much more inclusive, and nonetheless, as the question was asked, and as I try to say, this is one thing you put on paper as a resolution, but it was, yeah, the whole, I would say the whole infrastructure was meant to identify completely with the Jews. Now, again, I'm saying I want to stress the annihilation of the Jews was very central, and the Jews as an ideological was, I think, the central element in Nazi ideology, and it is, and we have to take this into consideration. We should not downplay this, but we do have to find a way. And now we talk a lot about genocide and the Genocide Convention. I think, despite critiques like that on Dirk Moses, at the end of the day, I think Lemkin understood it pretty well. And when he connected so many events with this word genocide that he coined in 1944, and which became a very problematic, though still important convention in 1940, in December 1948. So we have to go down that road, undoubtedly. I think we're already.
Okay, I think we have time for just one more question, if we can answer it briefly. What exactly was and is the contribution of the government of Israel to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance and to the work leading to its definition of anti-Semitism?
So it is I think it, I mean, the major, I didn't look into all the files, into the archival files yet. And, but my impression is that it was very central, though the one who was pushing it was Mark Weitzman from the American Jewish Committee. Now, the American Jewish Committee does not act I mean, it used to be an anti-Zionist organization, but in the last, like in 2015-16, when it was promoted, he was completely, it is a Zionist, very close to Israel. And Israel promoted it just a year before that, Israel organized a big conference in Jerusalem on anti-Semitism in 2000, and Bibi Netanyahu, and the same Netanyahu with which we are stuck today, called for the Europeans to adopt one definition of anti-Semitism. And he meant because it was already on the table since 2004-05 when it was first drafted. So I think Israel was and the Israeli delegation was and the Israeli academics, including, we can name some of them, like Dina Porat, was extremely important, and Yehuda Bauer was extremely important. And we should know that Dina Porat worked way before that, Professor Dina Porat of Tel Aviv University, way before that. And it was also portrayed, they worked also, the Mossad was also interested in that, in this fighting until it was really perceived as Anthony Lerman really described it. He was very central, and he published like 3 or 4 years ago on the whole process. It was very central in all those junctions. Israel was very, very, very prominent in the one in the IRA itself who really pushed for it most was Mark Weitzman, undoubtedly. As I say, from to the best of my knowledge.
Thank you, Amos. There are many lovely expressions of thanks and admiration for your lecture in the chat. It's been a very important contribution to our work. So I think that now we are going to put a slide up about our next event.
We should all pray that the genocide will stop. And this is, I think, something we can all pray for as soon as possible.
Inshallah. So the next lecture in the Bisan lecture series will be October 8th, 2025, 7 p.m. Palestine time. Professor Edvard I. Moser, who is professor at the Norwegian University of Sciences and Technology, will speak on neural network dynamics in entorhinal cortex, space and time. So you are all welcome to attend. If you're on the email distribution list, you'll receive an email with a link to register for the webinar. Thank you again, Amos, and thank you everyone for your attendance and attention.